Welcome, everyone. My name is Hannah Teichler. I am very happy to be the host of tonight's dMSA session or dMSA event, which is a roundtable on memory, crisis, and democracy in Africa. And I'm going to introduce our panelists in a minute. But before I do that, I would like to extend my warm thanks to everyone who made this event possible. This is, of course, the speakers and our discussant Adebayo, but also the people behind the scenes who are very much involved in organizing and getting dMSA off the ground each and every time. And among them, I would very much like to point out Lorena Ortiz Cabrero and Angus Foster, who are here today and who are our dear assistants and again facilitate everything that's going on here. What are you going to expect tonight, or what's our plan for tonight? So we have prepared a 45 to 60-minute roundtable phase where our speakers are going to provide you with their perspectives and input, and that will be followed by a response by Adebayo Sakiru. And we kindly ask you to switch off your camera if you haven't already done that during the roundtable and the discussion session, right? And you're very welcome to switch on your camera again once we enter the Q&A phase, so that you know who is speaking, who's on the roundtable, and so on and so forth. And again, after that 60 minutes phase, we will open the floor for questions and comments. I will revisit that topic later, but if you have any questions or comments, please do post your name into the chat so I can call on you for you to ask your questions. So again, welcome everyone, and it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers tonight. First of all, let me welcome Richard Benda, Dr. Richard Benda, who is zooming in, if I may call it that, from the Luther King House Open College in London. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Manchester.
In Manchester, I'm sorry, of course. And you are a political philosopher interested in the complex interactions between religious and political agency. Richard teaches contextual and practical theology at the Luther King House Open College, Theological College, and Durham University. His postdoctoral research explores different tropes of the aftermath of the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, in particular, intergenerational narratives, dialogues on guilt, shame, transformation, and accountability, as well as transitional temporalities and resistance and rescue as positive defiance. Very good, and I think that we will hear about that and more in a second. Our second speaker is Nancy Rushorora. She is zooming in from Tanzania, if I'm not mistaken. And she's a lecturer in archaeology and heritage studies at the University of Dar es Salaam and a research fellow at Exeter and Stellenbosch University. She has published widely on sites of memory and landscapes of trauma. Her single and co-authored articles include Look at Maji Maji, a plea for historical photographs in Tanzania, Desperate Mourning and Atrophied Representation, A Tale of Two Skulls, as well as other publications. And your current project is a digital one that is called the Generational Memories of the Maji Maji War. So welcome, Nancy. And our third speaker is Professor Liz Stanley from the University of Edinburgh. She is a professor of sociology and has been researching historical sociology and South African topics since the mid-1990s. The author of numerous journal articles and 17 books, of which the most relevant relating to the topic of tonight is Mourning Becomes, Post-Memory and the Concentration Camps of the South African War. And Adebayo has just said this is a seminal text, right? If you want to get to know something about memory politics in South Africa. So welcome, Professor Stanley. And last but not least, I would like to introduce our discussant tonight, Sakiru Adebayo. is a postdoctoral fellow at the Wits Institute of Social Economic Research in Johannesburg, South Africa. He's currently working on a manuscript which investigates the politics and representations of memory in African fiction. He has published in the Journal of African Cultural Studies, African Studies, Journal of Pan-African Studies, Research in African Literatures, Safundi, and many others. And I'm also happy to announce that you are also part of the Memory Studies Association's advisory board. So again, thank you all for coming, dear speakers and discussants. And I would like to hand over the floor to Richard, who's going to be our first speaker.
Thank you, and good afternoon, and good evening, good morning to everyone wherever you are. It's a privilege and a joy to be here. I do not call myself an expert in memory studies, but I think because I locate myself in Rwandan studies, most of the people who have been conducting research in post-genocide Rwanda, I think you would agree with me that we work and owe an awful lot to memory and to theories and concepts and methods that come from the field of memory studies. My own research, without falling neatly into memory studies, relies heavily on recollection and interpretation of the past, the politics and the policing of memory, and how memory is deployed in a framing of present identities and societal imagination of the future. It is mostly my postdoctoral work, which is really heavily steeped in memory, and more specifically in connection with the genocide against the Tutsi of 1994. I'm going to quickly, actually, I should have done this before, to just quickly put this up. As you can see from all the posters from previous Kwibuka, Kwibuka is the word, the Kinyarwanda word for to remember. And so it's just a Kwibuka 27 is currently an ongoing reminder of how collective memory is being shaped and institutionalized in post-genocide Rwanda. But when I started my postdoctoral research in 2013, I was more interested and I was more concerned by what I found to be the missing yet vital components of this collective memory, or what the Rwandan scholar Nyirubugara calls the parallel remembrances in a memory landscape, where there is a right past to remember and a wrong past to forget. So this has led me to study the intergenerational dialogues within the perpetrators in-group and the memories of rescue and resistance of Abarinzi b'Igihango, or the equivalent of the Rwandan Justs. And in this respect, in my research, it has been fascinating to study and observe how, in the context of suppressed ethnicities, intergenerational memories of shame and guilt on one side have been combined with memories of bravery from the same in-group and incorporated in the Ndumunyarwanda policy or politics or vision, which is a memory-infused reimagination of identity politics in post-genocide Rwanda. And at the origin of this political mammoth, because that is what really it is in current memory politics in Rwanda and identity politics, there is a story, a simple story of an encounter of two strands of memory. The memory of a young Hutu boy who interrupts commemorative testimonies of Tutsi survivors to ask if it would not be too offensive if he too could give an account of his memory of genocide. And I want to argue that it is these sort of interruptive and dialogical memories that offer a corrective to Nyirubugara's parallel remembrances and dual interpretations, and begin to lay the foundation for more useful trajectories, such as Rothberg's multidirectional memories in public space. So I'm just quickly to look at, beside people like me who invite ourselves in memory studies to plunder the discipline, if there is actually a sort of specific field of African memory studies applied to the Rwandan context. I'm doing this because what I didn't say at the beginning is that I tried to structure my presentation on the 4 questions that were proposed by the moderators. And this was not because of any form of slack or laziness, but it was a pragmatic decision to sort of organize material around quite complex issue. So I think that when you look around at the array of practices and mediums and rituals of remembrance, such as Icyunamo, Urwibutso, Kwibukanwa, the annual events, text, stories, testimonies, that one would think, or we should agree that there is, yes, a sort of Rwandan memory studies in the wider context of African memory studies. And particularly in the post-genocide era, I think Rwandan and non-Rwandan scholars from French and English-speaking circles, just to name those languages, right? I'm sure there are others, have been interested in the social, cultural, cognitive, political, technological shifts affecting how, what, and why Rwandans as individuals, groups, and society remember and forget. My former professor of law, Charles Namaka, has, for instance, looked at memory and reconciliation, focusing on the gap between popular practices and acts of authority. Jonathan Glover has looked at the politics of memory with a focus on commemoration as narratives of history. Barclay Zisto has looked at the short-term benefits and long-term dangers of choosing amnesia as a necessary mechanism for coexistence in local communities after the genocide. And colleagues like Gilbert are interested in the transnational aspects of memory by studying commemoration rituals and narratives in Rwandan diasporic communities. I think one of the most fascinating voices that I'm discovering now is Olivier Nyirubugara, who I think is in the Netherlands and has recently put out a 2-volume work called Memory Traps. The first is called Complexities and Dangers of Remembering and Forgetting in Rwanda. And the second is Novels of Genocide, Remembering and Forgetting Ethnic Other in Fictional Rwanda. So I think his work will definitely resonate with Adebayo, who is interested in fictional and the memory, the politics of memory in fictional or novels in Africa. And a thread that runs through both works, both Olivier's work, is this sort of challenging argument that I hope that we will be able to engage with, that Rwandans remember and forget in complex ways that fuel and perpetuate ethnic conflicts, whether this is open or whether this is latent. My quick comment and critique of memory studies in Rwanda is that they are just dominated by dysphoric work. And this is really, I think, because of the role the role that genocide and trauma play in these studies. I want to quickly talk briefly about memory, crisis, and democracy in Rwandan studies. And I'm going to reverse the order and talk about democracy, crisis, and memory. And I want to suggest that in my research, certainly in my reading of recollections of the past, these 3 concepts are connected, and for me, they form the metrics out of which the modern Rwandan state has emerged. and therefore they have shaped society, especially politics and the politics of identity. I'm not going to go into philosophical definition of democracy, but I want to be actually pragmatic and look at three phases in which there is this sequence of promise of democracy, crisis, and how the memory around those first dawns and the subsequent crisis and violence have shaped the nation and the people. And the first place to start, obviously, is 1900, when white Germans and Catholic white fathers come to Rwanda, and this marked the beginning of de facto colonial rule in Rwanda. However, we look at colonization from post-colonial point of view, I think in the mindset of colonial officials and Christianizing missions, there was this ideal of bringing a good deal or a better deal to the natives. Whether that was the outcome, it remained to be seen. But what I want to argue is that this era, which promised so much, actually ushered in a moment of tremendous crisis. And the first crisis for me, it's a crisis of memory, because so the crisis of memory and transmission of memory, because from then on, missionaries and the colonial officials became the medium and the gatekeepers of how the past will be remembered. And the second crisis obviously consisted of the onset of dismantling the pre-existing political and socioeconomic order, as parishes and administration headquarters became alternative sites of power and patronage in competition with the royal palace and the residency of the chiefs, sometimes with tragicomic consequences, one of which is the famous Hutu church in a Tutsi kingdom phenomenon reported by Linden, whereby the missionaries wanted to convert the Tutsi elite, but they end up with a mass of impoverished Hutu. The reason I'm mentioning this is that romanticized recollection of pre-colonial social harmony find really their first sternest rebuttal in this mass exodus and defection from traditional Rwandan patrons to new colonial or white masters. And then the other moment of promise is 1959, which, according to Olivier Nyirubugara, is the embodiment of the parallel remembering that exists in Rwanda's body politic. For the majority of Bahutu back then, this was a time of revolution, the overthrow of feudalism and monarchy. The independence was not an emergency then. But for the ruling Tutsi elite, this was a time of utter tragedy and loss of the nation. And from, in 1959, history was promising much: revolution, a future of democracy. It was after the Bandung Conference and the promise of a new dawn in Africa. But for Rwanda, this became one of the dark chapters in our history. And after the death of the king in 1959, the country descended in what Newbury has called a simmering cauldron. And as we know, after the November revolution for some, pogroms for others, it became a time of exile and questionable Republican politics. And then you have 1990, which has two interesting dates: June 1990, with the conference or the summit of La Baule and the famous let's talk about democracy, baby, or the pressure of France to make development aid conditional to democratization. And of course, the 1st of October, which marks the launching of the War of Liberation by the RPF. So if you think about democratization, liberal democratization and liberation, this would have promised much. In fact, this is the reason why I was really interested in studying constitutional law at university, because we hope that there was a new dawn for democracy in Africa. And as we know, the twin pressure of civil war and democratic paralysis led to what I think has been one of the most toxic ethnicity-fueled climate that ultimately engulfed the country in what we have known as the genocide against the Tutsi in 1994. The point I was trying to make here is that at different stages of Rwanda's history, the promises of democracy were supplanted by political crisis that ultimately shaped what we know as modern Rwanda. The memories of these forced democratic dawns and the traumas from subsequent crises continue to impact the politics of the country and the identities of the people. I have lost the thread of time, but I'm sure somebody will nudge me when I'm getting closer to my allotted slot. I want to then briefly really touch to a point that was suggested to talk about the role of memory and remembrance in nation building. For those who have worked in Rwanda and in commemoration rituals would have heard this motto, "Twibuke twiyubaka," or let us remember with self-rebuilding, self-reconstruction in mind. And this say quite explicitly the role that remembrance play in nation rebuilding in Rwanda. But I want to talk about this. I want to illustrate this through the case study of the suppression of ethnic identities and the promotion of Ndumunyarwanda as a case in point. And this fits within a logic of continuity because the current regime in Rwanda sees the period of 1959 to 1994 as an aberration or a political abnormality which should be bracketed and expunged from political and cultural memory. And this is because ethnic identities are seen not only as colonial constructs, but they are the perennially greatest threat to national unity, reconciliation, and reconstruction. And when the legal instrument to that effect were put in place recently, they were not a new initiative to cope with the legacy of genocide, but in my opinion, they represented a recovery of political imagination that had been put in suspension since 1959, when the Superior Council of the Umwami had voted a motion with a majority to press the colonial government to remove the terms Bahutu, Batutsi, and Batwa from all official documents. So this is a policy that had been actually put on ice for almost 60 years. And this sort of unfinished business has shaped political identity and is at the heart of the most recent and upgrade of the vision of national reconstruction in the form of Ndumunyarwanda. The emphasis here is not so much on what has to be remembered, but on what has to be forgotten. And as far as democracy in this vision is concerned, the suppression of ethnicity supports what the current government sees as idea-based democracy rather than numeric-based democracy. I will finish by just quickly touching on a point of the transnational, transcultural, and multidirectional connections in memory studies in Rwanda. Just to say that because the current regime in Rwanda evolved in exile, it is therefore better placed than anyone to understand the significance of diasporic communities and since 1959, the many conflicts that I have alluded to have created a different generation of migration and diasporic communities, both in Africa and in the West. And each of this generation migrated and lived with specific memories of the past and memories that have evolved transgenerationally as the second, the third generation in some cases grew up in different cultural milieus. I think the Rwandan diaspora is one of the most active in the world. And I would probably defer to colleagues of mine like Catherine Gilbert who work in this area. But I would like to postulate that the Rwandan diasporas now have become the most exciting and at times the most toxic sites of discourse on memory and politics in Rwanda. Because lobbies, solidarities, affinities with other historical events such as the Shoah and the ongoing humanitarian tragedy in DRC, academic interest with increasingly predictable royalties have moved this memory discourse to a truly transnational and transcultural plane, creating memory discourses that are competitive and I would probably suggest multidirectional. One has to only look at the composition of the different panels that have been convened during the many Kwibuka events that have marked the ongoing 27th commemoration, or the storm that has been recently caused by the two authors, the Canadian Judy River and the British Michelle Wrong, around issues of revisionism, genocide denial, and the problematic double genocide theory. And how about the report, the recent report by the French government establishing the historical responsibility of France in the genocide against the Tutsis? So I will conclude by saying that transnationalism offers interesting new developments in memory and democracy discourse in Rwandan studies. It is believed, rightly or wrongly, in some academic circles that in Rwanda, the politics of memory are tightly controlled and monitored by an authoritarian state that brook no dissenting voices. Therefore, as some scholars would argue, the zero-sum logic is obvious and has always been obvious as the regime in place allows and promotes one version, the dominant narrative, and criminalizes the others. My suggestion is that diasporic communities might offer or allow for the kind of multidirectional memory discourse that Rothberg has offered as an alternative to the zero-sum logic of competing memories and dual remembrances. I will stop here, and if there are points that you felt I should have raised, please do so in the QA. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Richard. Also for keeping almost to your time frame. Thank you so much. And I would like to hand over the stage to Nancy.
Thank you so much. And I'll take up from where Richard has ended and bringing in another close country to Rwanda, which is Tanzania. And on my side, I'm approaching memory from heritage and archaeology angle. And I start by discussing that in Tanzania, the claim to memory and democracy is actually seen as one of the important issue. And memory is seen to have potential to avoid dangers of the past crimes. And most of the time, this is emphasized on colonialism and resistance. And now my studies in memory in Tanzania has been about the Maji Maji War, which is the German colonialism, which is the German resistance against, it is a Tanzanian resistance against the German colonialism in Tanzania, which occurred around 1904 and 1908. So most of my studies have been around the German colonialism and how the memory of the Maji Maji War are still playing part in the communities and the trauma that are still instilled in the community more than 100 years ago since the war occurred in Tanzania. In this process, I've also been dealing with how these memories have been playing part in the government and other national institutions, and how the scrutinization of this memory has also led to appropriation and sometimes a lack of democracy that the memory is actually supposed or claimed to have brought to Tanzania. So as much as memory is seen as something that is potential to avoid danger of colonialism in Tanzania, collective memory has been used at the national level, has a major condition for Tanzania's stability. So the stability of the country, the peacefulness, actually sometimes Tanzania is referred as the harbor of peace or the heaven of peace because of it being stable and learning from memory of colonialism and resistance that were raised during colonialism, that war can never at any point yield to stability of a country like Tanzania. So through this process, Tanzania has actually played part in rewriting the history of the country and actually taking out the memory of colonialism from the community and nationalizing them at a country level. And this has been seen in actually two projects. One of it is immediately after independence, where we see the establishment of the University of Dar es Salaam and the history department, which was tasked to rewrite the history of Tanzania using the collective memory of the community from different communities of Tanzania. This history that was rewritten was made mandatory for all the students in Tanzania to learn in schools. Unfortunately, this was only taught until 1980s and it was abandoned. Now, in 2020, we also saw the same thing rising again, where we are actually in the process of rewriting the history of Tanzania, or rewriting what actually is supposed to be memorized, and now collecting different views from the communities and putting it as a standard history textbook, which will also be taught in all levels of education in Tanzania. And this new wave now will actually start in July this year. Now, all these attempts do not see actually any danger that a memory presents as a threat, like as a political threat to cultural and ethnic boundaries. So much as this is seen as bringing the stability of the country and memorializing, choosing what to memorialize, actually present a threat to cultural and ethnic boundaries. For example, these have actually been witnessed already in areas where the government-sponsored memorialization have not completely or fully taken place. So where some of the communities have not been fully engaged, there are also already started to be seen some conflicts. But also we have already seen some challenges in memorialization sponsored festivals. So the government sponsored memorialization festivals that have been on one community and not the other, and especially for the Maji community, which affected more than 20 ethnic groups, but only one ethnic group is actually sponsored in terms of a memorialization festival. So this has already been questioned and posing threats actually to the democratization or the democracy that might be seen in terms of memory. Another thing is that the landscape presents also a space that has also been questioned in terms of how the space is memorialized. The space has monuments which were created during colonialism, but at the same time, the landscape bear witness to things that are actually not monumental. Sometimes the empty space is commemorated by the community, alluding it to different things that occurred either during the war or have continued in the process and causing trauma to the community. So different ways, routes, sometimes toponyms have been used to raise a sense of memory. And sometimes these are not always included in terms of memorialization. Now, ignoring this aspect of memory creates a conflict between the community and the government, because it feels like they are forced to remember what they don't think that it's important, and they are forced to forget what they think is important. And another aspect is on the attention here that is pressed on remembering and forgetting, that sometimes remembering depends on a successful forgetting. So memory sometimes is based between remembering and forgetting. And it has played a major part in memorialization of trauma among the people who were victims of the Maji-Maji War. Some of these victims were of a colonial origin. For example, the German missionaries who were in Tanzania during the Maji-Maji War created a very strong archive that documented all the process that took place there, all the activities that took place there. These archives have remained closed to the public. So the archives are only used by the German missionaries in Tanzania without giving access to the community. Unfortunately, some of the things that are archived there were collected from the community directly, but the community is now forced to forget all those stuff. And some of the victims who their forefathers were executed during the Maji-Maji War actually choose to forget so that they can heal from the trauma of the past. But sometimes they choose to forget so that they can avoid the government to press them. And this type, the government here is the German government. For example, people who their forefathers killed, German officials, missionaries, they are forced to forget, or they choose to forget these memories so as to avoid conflict with the government of either side. There is also the aspect of transnational and cross-cultural memories in Tanzania. In this aspect, there are transnational and cross-cultural memories. This is not a field that is broadly explored in Tanzania, although there are a lot of areas that transnational and cross-cultural memories do play a part. Of recent, it was my personal encounter with a slave trade site, which is associated with the French slave trade. And this slave trade site is linking the East African coast with Mauritius as well as Seychelles. Now, according to the local history of the site or the memory of the community, is that this community was created out of slaves who were to be shipped to French colonies, and because of the cruising of the Germans and Portuguese around the southern coast of East Africa, they were unable to be shipped to the French colonies. So they ended up in that village, which is called Mgao, and they established their residence there. So the village was actually created out of slaves. And these slaves, according to the archival sources, these slaves trace their origin in different parts of East African coast, such as Mombasa, Lamu. Some of them were from Bagamoyo and other sites in the southern coast of Tanzania. So the creation of this site is linking it with other sites such as Mauritius, where the slave traders were coming from, and they were taking them to those French colonies. Now, there is no any effort that has been made to collect these memories from Tanzania, linking them with those of Mauritius, Kenya, and all other sites that have been mentioned. This is actually the same with the Maji Maji, whereby a project that was based on the memories of the Maji Maji War was actually conducted like 10, 15 years ago. And it was for the centenary of the Maji Maji War, when it was about 100 years of the war. This project was actually very successful, putting together scholars from Tanzania, German, and who were working on the German colonialism, either in Tanzania or in Germany. Unfortunately, I don't know, maybe it was because maybe memory studies was not more popular like currently, or I don't know why, but most of these studies did not concentrate more on memory, but mostly on different other aspects of the war. So it was about the causes, the effects, and partly the battlefield. So you see that there is still a gap of research that actually connect memory studies cross-country or transnational, and actually cross-cultural. So I think I will stop here, and I'll come back later, maybe during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nancy, for your amazing input and your case study, which resonates with what I'm doing, just to say that. But I'll shut up and hand over the stage to Liz Stanley. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think that there are very interesting resonances, both between the two presentations we've already heard, but also I hope you'll see that there are with what I'm going to talk about as well. As Hannah said in her kind introduction earlier, I've been working on research topics concerned with South Africa since the middle 1990s, including living and working there for extended periods, but I'm not South African. And so I feel more than hesitation in speaking on behalf of those who are. So what I'll do is I'll try and confine myself to expressing my own viewpoint, which I think can be summarized by saying that it's that of a critical friend. I've also stuck quite closely to the questions posed by the organizer. I thought they were very good to think with. So the structure of what I'm going to say for the next 15-20 minutes will follow that, and I'll tell you what the questions were that they asked us. So the first was, what role does the field of memory studies play in my research context? And would I say that there's a field of memory studies, a kind of a defined body of work? Well, although as a sociologist, my research has been overwhelmingly concerned with historical topics in periods where living memory doesn't stretch, so unlike most of my sociological colleagues, memory, remembrance and forgetting in related terms have been central to what I do across my academic career, which is now a long one. And since 1994, not all, but a very large part of my research has been about the South African past. And that's different from the other past that we've been hearing about. It has its own specificity. And I've also been interested in the reverberation of claims about that past in the present. So the same terms, memory, remembrance, and forgetting, and so on, have taken on a particular inflection because of this context, the specificity of South Africa and what happened in it both historically and is happening now contemporaneously. Now, whether there's a field of South African memory studies depends, of course, on how this is defined, how it's thought about and how it's formulated. And as I say, I don't want to make general statements on behalf of South African academics. But what I can say from the outside and as a critical friend is that there's a good deal of research interest in commemoration of different kinds. And it's the material end of such things, the monuments, the memorials and so on, that has been particularly developed, and there's some absolutely outstanding work on that. But the trickier aspects of remembering and forgetting and how these are intertwined, the things that I'm particularly interested in, have been rather less the preoccupation of South African colleagues. And I'll say some more about that in a minute. The second question given to us was, what do the terms memory, crisis, and democracy mean in the particular research context? And how are they connected in that research context? Now, I'll answer that, first of all, by saying something about 3 examples of work that I've done, and then I'll try and draw it together and make some more general comments. The first concerns a book which Hannah also and also Adebayo mentioned at the beginning, called Morning Becomes: Post-Memory Commemoration and the Concentration Camps of the South African War. That book resulted from a research project which was concerned with the memory aftermath of the South African War of 1899 to 1902. And specifically, it was concerned with those who were forgotten, sometimes by happenstance, but more often deliberately so. And this included Boer, that is, people now known as Afrikaner, Boer people who supported Britain rather than other Boers, Boer men who didn't fight, women who were nationalist agitators as well as feminists, black people who were said not to be present but who were in large numbers, and children of all skin colours who suffered and many of whom died, many of whom died. This research recovered their names insofar as this was possible, and it followed them through part of their lives during the period of the war and many of their deaths, and then into the commemorative record or in being effaced from it. And it tried to give them and restore names to these people. But as well as the archival material which addressed the issue of the name, it also researched the camp cemeteries where the name was valorized and marked, and their nationalist transformation into state commemorative sites. And in doing so, it used Bakhtin's ideas about the chronotope, a chronotope of Afrikaner nationalist commemoration in doing so. Now, one of the key critics of that war was somebody called Olive Schreiner, and the project that immediately followed the book was the Olive Schreiner Letters Project, which published in full all the extant letters of Olive Schreiner, who was an internationally famous feminist writer and social critic, who was a key opponent both of the South African War and of the imperialist presence in Southern Africa more generally. And the letters online, the Olive Schreiner Letters Online, is now used widely internationally by many thousands of people a year. The letters are provided, all of the letters, and absolutely in full, including deletions, crossings out, and so on. And this has enabled those users to draw on the resources provided, which also includes many of Schreiner's manuscripts too, in their own particular ways, some of which I like and some of which I don't like so much. This has importantly included remembering, in inverted commas, the South African past in a different way, in reading that past against the grain of earlier accounts, which were inflected or shaped or determined in many respects by nationalist intentions and ideologies. And those of you who follow the news will know that many of those letters and many more records as well were devastated in the University of Cape Town fire a couple of weeks ago and the destruction of the Jagger Reading Room. So now the simulacral versions that exist on the Olive Schreiner Letters Online, for several thousand of them, they're the only things that now exist. The Whites Writing Whiteness project followed and it's ongoing. And this is concerned with the reverberations and the making of memory and remembering and forgetting in the period from the 1770s to the 1970s, and how whites in South Africa represented the world and people around them, and changes in how they did so over time. So it's ongoing. And like the Olushina Letters Project, it publishes the research data itself, which is primarily letters, but other writings as well, in order to facilitate research by other people, alongside the research that I and my colleagues have produced. And this project too has been concerned with reading against the grain, in focusing on the variety of different kinds of representations by differently situated groups of people, and the disagreements and conflicts as well as agreements that occurred. So the terms memory, crisis, and democracy, and the opposite of those, are all part of the analytical frameworks of the interconnected research projects I've carried out, added to, of course, with nationalism, race and racism, inequality, and others, including, let us not forget, the complexities of representation and how we interpret it, and the importance of recognizing that the trace, that is, the remaining traces of past lives and events, has great ontological and epistemological complexity, and we forget that complexity at our intellectual peril. Now, our individual research, mine and everybody else's on such matters, may be more or less successful, more or less read, more or less influential. But my particular concern has been to ensure that many more people than just me are enabled to join this, what I hope and I'm sure is, a collective endeavour of interrogating the South African past and the ways in which it's been constructed and used. Now, the third question we were asked about is, what role does memory and remembrance play in nation-building contexts in your research? Well, of course, as you'll have gathered from what I've said already, it plays a role that is uncomfortable, powerful, and in many ways terrible in relation to Afrikaner nationalism. Boer women's testimonies of their memories, in inverted commas, were part of their political activities and were partial. They were the truth, but not the whole truth, and were certainly not nothing but the truth. Those memories were transferred through the concentration camp cemeteries and remembrance of the people who died into a commemorative project that was taken over by the nationalist government. So it became a state project, which literally took over because in many cases it bulldozed the original cemeteries in order to create huge commemorative memorial sites. The role that those things play is also uncomfortable too in relation to more recent post-1994 nation building, about which I won't say much for time reasons, but just remind you, and we don't need that because we've already heard from both Nancy and Richard that this is so, that recent nation building involves race and ethnicity intersecting in complex ways, which raise powerful and fundamental questions about memory, remembering, and forgetting. We were asked to provide a quick case study to show how memory politics work in our own neck of the woods. Well, I refer you again to that Cape Town fire a few weeks ago and its destruction of the Jagger Reading Room and many, many archive collections, not just Olushina, along with it. A friend of mine teaching a history and sociology course on the Monday following the fire on Sunday found her students cheering. It doesn't matter, she was told, because it's just the archive records of white people, those who were complicit in apartheid. And when they heard that the fire had also reached the Rhodes Memorial, I'm sure you can imagine what happened then, that the cheers got louder. So the flames were fierce and they destroyed, but the memory politics are also fierce and they continue. The fourth question posed by the organisers is about transnational, transcultural and multi-directional connections in relation to memory, democracy and crisis. Well, of course, there are such connections. There are always such connections. And some quick examples will illustrate some of the difficult, tricky issues that exist. Firstly, as my comments about cheering the destruction of the archive collections at the University of Cape Town Jagger Library indicate, There is, for those outside of South Africa particularly, the power of the term apartheid, in the sense that many non-South Africans have, that they know exactly what it means and how it should be remembered, and they probably think that most people in South Africa don't remember it properly. So apartheid acts as a kind of block to remembering and forgetting and thinking often in the present, because people assume they know what was involved. Secondly, and more recently, there's the role of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, not so much in how it handled testimony and memory in that sense, although there are issues about that as well, but more in the way it valorized Afrikaner history making by taking its pronouncements about the South African past, and specifically the South African War and what happened during it, on trust and as the truth, a rather reprehensible strategy which was part of the nation building programme the TRC was itself involved in promoting for contemporary South Africa. So we have a very interesting, very knotty problem with remembering around the TRC. The third example involves conflicting developments in South Africa now concerning memory and commemoration. I have a successor project to the ones I've already mentioned, a recently started project on Black commemoration and memorialisation post-1994. So this is concerned with the ANC's government's policy of counter-memorialisation, that is, of countering memorials by building new ones, not destroying or removing the old ones. And it's involved us tracking policy documents and researching in a multimodal way its many commemorative projects on the ground, starting with the Eastern Cape, but spreading to the other provinces in contemporary South Africa as well. And there's also a dedicated research website on this, which, like the other projects, provides much of the data being collected so that other people can use it. And for those of you who might be interested, it can be accessed via the Whites Writing Whiteness website. So that's the state project of the ANC government. But of course, we hear the cheering of those students about the Cape Town fire. There's something occurring in South Africa and also internationally, which is in direct conflict with this ANC state level of counter-memorial activity. And this concerns the hashtag campaigns, which seek to remove old memorials, to destroy them rather than rewrite or counter them, and of which Rhodes Must Fall is the best known. So there's much food for thought in what's happening contemporaneously. And it's not gone away. It's resurfacing around Black memorialisation and counter memorialisation. So I'll stop there, and we'll look forward to the discussion that will follow. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. Thank you so much, Liz, Richard, and Nancy, for this very rich conversation on memory, democracy, and crisis in Africa. And I will just go straight into my response. So I'm supposed to respond to the three speakers. I thought my job would be very easy, just to summarize everything you've said, but it doesn't look like it. So I'll begin by reading a paragraph from the book titled Memory in the Post-Colony, or Memory and the Post-Colony, by edited by Richard Webner. I think it's like one of the most seminal texts when it comes to post-colonial memory or memory in Africa. And it's so interesting because when thinking about memory and democracy and crisis, that this book actually starts with a statement that in post-colonial Africa, memory as a public practice is increasingly in crisis. So that's the very first sentence that, in the book. And then he goes on to say that memory's contribution to the critique of power and to the very grounds of political subjectivity is ever more broadly contested, again, in the African context. And then he goes on to say that the moral force of memory is becoming uncertain, more indefinite and ambiguous. And so the post-colonial memory crisis emerging widely across the African continent is not merely over what is to be remembered publicly or forgotten publicly, but the challenge in the everyday life, in major public occasions, and in disruptive events of terror and civil unrest to the very means and modes of remembrance. I will stop there and then say that I really like that we have different presentation in different contexts, and by different contexts, I do not only mean that we have someone who is working on Rwanda, someone who is working on Tanzania, and someone who is working on South Africa. Although I wish we could have other contexts outside of Rwanda and South Africa, because I feel like that's usually when it comes to memory in the African context, it's always about, especially in the memory studies cycle, it's always about Rwanda and in South Africa. But another thing that I see that it brings all these three presentations together is that the crisis of memory in Africa can be divided or can be thought of in about three different ways. And first of all is the memory of colonialism, which Nancy and even Richard and Liz's presentation, they all touch on the memory of colonialism, in the unfinished business of colonialism on the African continent. And there are several ways of also thinking about that, about the memory of colonialism on the African continent. And one of the crises I would say about the memory and colonialism on the African continent is also the way that European countries or colonial powers have actually kind of constructed the idea of post-colonial memory, in the sense that when we think about post-colonial memory, we think about how Europe is dealing or is not dealing with their colonial hangover. When there is so much of trauma of colonialism that's still going on even on the continent. And I appreciate the fact that Nancy, in Nancy's presentation, she did make mention of some of those things. And also part of the crisis of memory and colonialism, of course, is also one of the huge debates that is currently going on today about repatriation of stolen artifacts and the crisis around that. How do we return this, these artifacts, and how? And one of the things that you hear these colonial powers say, or excuses they give, is that these countries cannot take care of these artifacts by themselves. And I think that in itself is some sort of crisis. Another thing about memory and colonialism, of course, is that of settler colonialism, which Liz's presentation did hint on here and there, especially in the context of South Africa, where unlike Tanzania, the colonialists still remain. And then what does it mean to build a nation alongside with with the colonizer? I mean, you've given a lot of examples, Liz, but also because I am currently situated in South Africa, it seems there's so much going on. For instance, just recently, Port Elizabeth had been changed again. The name Port Elizabeth has been changed to a local name, just like Pretoria has also been changed. So there is that ongoing process of, I don't know if to use your word, counter-memorialism, as you called it, Liz, but also the other thing that some sort of crisis again of memory, especially in the context of settler colonialism on the continent, is then that in the South African context, there is, of course, the elephant in the room, which is race, and then so how to think about whiteness and the memory of whiteness in post-apartheid South Africa. And one of the things I would say is that whiteness is heterogeneous in South Africa. It's not homogeneous. So we do have a faction of Afrikaner nationalists who decide to go to another town. One of the examples is Orania, where it's an all-white city, an all-white town, where they put up apartheid heroes, where they sing apartheid national anthems, where everything, it looks like you're still in the apartheid era. And then there is the more progressive liberal whiteness that is more open to decolonizing the memory of colonialism in the country. So this is also part of the crisis of memory that is going on in the context of settler colonialism on the continent, but then also moving on to post-independence wars. One of the things that that is very interesting is that after the end of colonialism, official end of colonialism, because we all know that colonialism is still an unfinished business on the continent, but after the very like official end, when the colonial masters left, um, almost all African countries had one sort of like civil war. In the Rwandan case, it's a genocide. In the Nigerian case, it's the Biafran War. In the Angolan case, it's a war that lasted for 27 years. So there is, first of all, there is the influence of the colonial encounter in how those wars played out, right? But also then how to think about, because now I think that the continent has moved beyond that stage of civil war to another kind of epoch of like making sense and coming to terms with with these wars, and so I think that's where Richard's presentation also becomes really important. And one of the things that I want to just lay out about post-independence or post-colonial, another angle to post-colonial memory on the continent, and also linking it with democracy and crisis, is the very surprising rate of state repression after these wars have happened. For instance, in the Biafran context, in the Nigerian context, there is a kind of intentional institutionalized amnesia going on where over many decades after the war, there is no site of commemoration of the war at all. The same thing, I mean, in a sense, can be spoken when it comes to the Rwandan context, where you ask yourself, is Kagame's administration a benevolent, a democracy, or a benevolent autocracy? So, and the reason I'm saying this is just the way that political parties, because another thing that happens when the colonial masters left is that anti-colonial movements then broke into different political parties on the continent, and then there was some sort of party politics, and that is still going on. In the South African context, you have the ANC and the DA. In the Angolan context, you have MPLA and UNITA. In Nigeria, you have PDP and APC. And so, but what you notice in this party politics is that the party that retains power then claims right to monopolizing historiography, in the sense, for instance, in the Angolan context, the MPLA has been in power since the Portuguese colonial masters left in 1975, and they have constructed the narrative in a way that abdicates them of the responsibility they have towards the gross violation of human rights that happened during the civil war in the country. So there is party politics, and that's why again, going back to Richard Wagner's book Memory and the Post-Colony, where he says that politicized memory is at the heart of post-colonial nation states. Then the other thing, and so because of this monopolization of rights or claims to memorialization on the continent, then there is no room, and also because of institutionalized amnesia and state repression, there is no room for some sort of democratized memory or agonistic conversations around memory. The other thing that also came out from all the presentations is the funding of commemoration on the continent. For instance, when Nancy was talking about the funding of the memory festivals in Tanzania, and how the people who give the funding have a power on how the narrative is structured. And also we can see that even in the Rwandan case, where the Kigali Memorial Center and some other memorial centers in Rwanda are not actually funded by the Rwandan government, or by any Rwandan, but mostly by Aegis Trust. If Richard, I would like to hear your thoughts on this, which is a British NGO. And I think that kind of has an influence on the way the narrative is constructed and who the memorials are made for, and how they are made, and also a little bit also speaks to Western influence in the way post-colonial commemoration also happens on the continent. And the other thing that I also want to mention is that, and again, this goes back to the culture of memorialization or culture of commemoration on the continent, because like if you go to Sierra Leone, where there was a war that happened for, I think, about 18 years. And after the war, the people, there was a lot of silence. And then a lot of people were concerned and they went to the country and like, you need to speak about what happened. They tried to institute the TRC following the South African model, and it was unsuccessful. And what you keep hearing the people say is that we need to move on, we need to make money, we need to survive. The same thing also if you go to the Angolan situation. Instead of national reconciliation, the government's propaganda has been reconstruction. Let us rebuild the country because the war, led to damage in public infrastructure. So let's reconstruct. And so there is usually that emphasis on reconstruction. And sometimes it looks like a kind of deflection from, wanting to reconcile. But at the same time, it could actually speak to a post-war political economy that creates the impression that, remembering is too much of a price to pay. And that makes us to ask again the question of the culture of commemoration, on the continent, especially when you remove South Africa and Rwanda. And then I also like the fact that Richard made about the diasporic community. So one of the things also, if you read like the history of conflict on the continent, is that after many of these civil wars and in the 1980s and 1990s, a lot of Africans left to the West, and the diasporic community has really helped to break the fog of state repression and culture of amnesia, because now people in diaspora can speak without the fear. Well, maybe with the fear, because now we know that people that oppose the Rwandan government in diaspora get killed. But maybe people in diasporic communities are able to speak more loudly about some of these things that have been repressed on the continent. So it's very interesting how diasporic communities contribute to democratizing memory on the continent, and also how that links to the question of transnational and also transgenerational memory, because also a large number of these people in the diasporic communities are actually children of survivors, not necessarily survivors themselves. And maybe just to end on the question of transnational memory, I guess the question I would like to pose to all of you speakers is how to think of transnational memory in the way that, if we can think of some sort of African transnationalism. For instance, as Richard pointed out, the Rwandan genocide it wasn't just about Rwanda. There were bordering nations like Uganda, and all these other bordering nations who had one or two roles to play in the genocide. And also, very ironically, it was in 1994 also when South Africa was transitioning from apartheid to democracy that this genocide happened in Rwanda. So how to think of African transnationalism? And the reason I'm saying that is because of the tendency in the global memory discourse to marginalize certain memories. And so maybe African transnational memory then can allow for some sort of lateral conversations among African countries. So maybe you help me think through this. So these are some of the provocations that I thought came out from your presentations. I'm not sure if there are questions, but they're just thoughts that came when you were presenting. So I'll just like to end here and then see if Richard, Nancy, or Liz has something to say to some of the points that I've raised before we open the floor to the audience. Thank you.
Perhaps I could say something. As I'm sure most people will be aware, that there is a debate about South African exceptionalism and a rejection of the idea that it's an exception on the continent. And I wonder whether that argument would be quite so accepted quite so receptively if it was made about other places in South Africa, other places in Africa. I mean, if one tried to remove the specificity of Rwanda and the specificity of other places, there would be, I think, a recognition that I don't mean local in a small sense, but the specific histories, specific events preceding colonialism matter. They matter. They shouldn't be expunged, and nor should we think about these issues just through the lens of colonialism. I think that the danger is that everything that a Pan-African approach gets entangled too much within a colonial framework, and does not take into account that there was a Pan-African continent before colonialism, and that needs to be taken into account, including its continuing structuring effects, both through the period of colonialism and also contemporaneously now. So I take your point, but I think that there is a danger of it being of thinking through the lens of colonialism, rather than trying to see whether there's something that is pan, that is trans, that lies beyond that.
Thank you, Liz, and I think indeed, I think I am a fan of Pan-Africanism. I really love Pan-Africanism. I did Pan-African for my master's. I agree with Liz that sometimes our Pan-Africanist imagination is so colonially influenced that we fail to see that we have to problematize the name Africa itself, especially because it is something that is externally bestowed upon us. And yes, and I think we really have to start questioning all this. I look at when you look at the map of Africa, you can see you sense it's like a scar. It's like looking at a scalpel that has passed on a body and left a very ugly scar with those straight lines and very straight angles and so on and so forth. And I think especially from for instance the perspective of West Africa and the vast communities and empires that went beyond the current boundaries. And it's just amazing to see how those transnational communities have been reduced to buying into national nation states politics. I always find it absolutely amazing when you look at Ivory Coast and Burkina Faso. Even when history is looking, even recent history is showing that there are more transnational connections and solidarities that are possible, that we still have a view of Africa which is defined by the nation state. Maybe there is something great to say for whatever Kagame does and the desire that he had to have this African passport for Africans to begin to know one another, there is nothing as absolutely amazing than to realize that it is harder to go from Accra to DRC than it is to go from Kigali to Brussels. So I think there's ways of looking how actually we used to travel through those spaces. The other thing I really want to comment on is the sort of African transnationalism and memory. it is how little we study other African realities. I remember being very much interested. My MA dissertation was on the concept of faith-based diplomacy, looking at the wars in Zimbabwe or Rhodesia and Mozambique, and the knowledge you gain from understanding those other the African other is absolutely phenomenal, and yet I think we are the least interested in discovering what is happening next door. It was just a passing comment, and to supplement what Liz had just said. But African transnationalism will happen through interest in crossing borders and facilitating that as well.
Thank you very much. I was just going to ask Nancy, but I think she's no longer here, maybe because of network. But what I just to quickly respond to to both of you, um, the idea of African transnational memory is really a response to the transnational move within memory studies. So within memory studies itself, there is, and they call it the third wave of memory study that has gone transnational, transcultural, multidirectional. But then the thing with that transnationalization and transculturation is that uh, even some memories still get left on the margins, like, and the Holocaust or Euro-American memories still take the center stage. So my framing or my thinking of an African transnational memory is to say that there are so many sites of so many transnational sites of memory on the continent. For instance, in Johannesburg here where I live, there is a Rwandan Memorial Center, you know, in Johannesburg, South Africa. So my idea is how to think about that kind of memorial in South Africa, which is about Rwanda. Or for instance, the other example would be, say, the African Renaissance, what's it called? The African Renaissance Memorial in
Yes.
Dakar, Senegal, which is not national. Like, it's not national. It's it's broad. And so I think that there are sites of transnational memories or transnational memory on the continent which are currently understudied, but also that the idea of transnational, an African transnational memory can challenge or critique the very reproduction of marginalization that is already embedded within the transnational memory, transnational memory as it is currently articulated in memory studies, discourses. So that's the way I'm thinking about, African transnational memory. But then I already see the fault lines there, in the sense that, like Liz was saying, it's very hard then to move beyond, colonial frameworks, because then even the idea of the nation state itself is very, very, colonial, at least within the continent. So yeah, that's what I was gesturing towards.
It also becomes very difficult to get away from state levels of activity, and to relegate the complexities of memory as they occur in the fabric of everyday life in all of its different varieties in a country. And I think probably there's a wide spread of interest amongst the people who are here. Some people much more interested in the state level or the big projects of commemoration, which tend to have that kind of transnational aspect, or at least aspiration to them, because often they fail. But what I'm much more interested in are these kinds of the trickier aspects of how things are remembered and forgotten at a much more local, and I think in many ways much more complex levels, because they play out in lots of different aspects of life, of which of course Rwanda is, an example that must remain with us, that these things that these things matter to people enormously, such that they are prepared to do the most terrible things in promoting them.
May I briefly interject here? Thank you everyone for your amazing contributions, and invite the general audience to switch on their cameras and pose any questions you might have, or use the raise your hand function of Zoom. There is already one question in the chat, voiced by Jen. Jen, would you like to ask your question perhaps yourself?
Okay, hello. Might lose connection, so I will remove the video again. I'm actually curious in the various collaborations, and you brought up some examples, and that's for any of the speakers. I was actually wondering, in terms of, you mentioned a few European institutions like that British NGO, Aegis. Is there any focus, or do you think that it's fruitful to have more of a focus on a tricontinental approach, like, you know, South American and Middle Eastern thinkers, as opposed to a more kind of European institutions orientation? I know it's a very general question, but I was thinking a lot in these terms, even, you know, I come from an Irish context, so, you know, both colonial and European, and I'm actually really interested in that orientation, and I was just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
If I may just chip in, okay, so the thing is, when you were talking, I just remembered a book by Shumei Shi. She's a professor at UCLA, and she wrote a book called Minor Transnationalism, where she speaks about how minority cultures can have transnational exchanges, you know, without the very hegemonic presence of you know, of America. You know, it's mostly in the context of America. But then, I mean, maybe one of the major flaws of that argument is that, you know, there is a major transnationality, or there is a majority culture that these minority cultures are moving away from. But then, I think outside of memory studies, there are quite a number of, like, for instance, the colonial you know, the colonial study groups. I don't know if that's what they call it, but there is some sort of many actually collaborations between African countries and you know, South American countries, especially around the issues of decolonization, but not necessarily in memory studies. I'm not very sure about memory studies, but in other areas, especially decolonization, you know, there is that that's collaborations and exchanges, you know, going on, and in other disciplines too, I suppose.
Richard, Liz, or Nancy, would you like to reply as well, or to one another, or?
I was just thinking about something that Nancy said. Maybe I didn't hear her properly when she was talking about commemorate or remembering, or memory being a luxury that people cannot afford. And I wonder if there is that really just points to sort of almost a paucity, a poverty of imagination in sharing memories. And I want to also see Jen's question with link it with what Ade was saying about the power and the means to sponsor the sponsoring of commemoration, and the power that is behind the ability to remember, and not having the means to remember, because so what I'm trying to say is whether there is actually a point to be made about the economics of memory and this, and if there is any form of solidarity of the poor in this. I remember reading Le Gouverneur de la Rosée of Jean-Jacques Roumain in Haiti, and the whole concept of la réconciliation des pauvres, how the poor try to reconcile. I'm just wondering if there is a sort of an economic of memory that we have to think about, but also a paucity or a poverty of imagination in this. But I think the idea of a tricontinental solidarity of the formerly oppressed is worth entertaining in future events, because I think it would encourage us to think about the memory, not just as a fuzzy thing, but the pragmatic aspects of transnational memory.
Thank you very much to both. Some great thoughts there. Thank you.
Excellent. And there's a question from Mr. Karim. Would you like to ask your question yourself? Okay, perhaps he can't speak or hear us. So the question's in the chat. I have a question about the links between memory and nation building. This is perhaps a pretty broad question. Some of the issues were already raised, but perhaps you can hazard an answer to that if you can't further specify
Sorry, there's a very interesting discussion of this that we haven't touched on, but it's in one of the founding works on memory, and that's Maurice Halbach's on collective memory. Where Halbach talks about the way the Crusaders marched into Jerusalem, found it inadequate in representing their vision of what Jerusalem was really factually, truly like, and set about remaking it. So it's a very powerful instance of a transnational project of a colonial kind, in which memory became forefront in how people responded to place and remade place as well as social relations. And of course, over 1,000 years later, we still live with the reverberations of that.
That's such a very fascinating point you've made, Liz. And I mean, there's nothing to say even to top that. But I just want to go back to Richard's question about, and also I would like to hear Nancy's input on this, the fact that people cannot afford to commemorate, and if that is a poverty of imagination. And what I can say to that, again, from, because I did a little bit of study on the post-war Sierra Leone, and and what I can say firstly is that many of this, post-war context, after the war, they are usually economically devastated, right? And except there is aid from Western countries, sometimes, yes, there is that post-war economy of survival. People want to survive more than building one big memorial or monument. That's particularly to the Sierra Leonean context. Unlike in South Africa, South Africa is a rich country. They have money to be able to put up all of this, monuments and memorials. But then the other thing that, again, going back to Nancy's point, it shows that to build a monument or a memorial is some sort of, privilege in a way. And perhaps also another way to think about it is that for instance, if you look at the African Renaissance Monument in Dakar, it was built by a North Korean company. You know, it wasn't even built by architects in Senegal, or again going back to Aegis, funding some memorials in Rwanda, and it makes me to think about maybe there are other ways of commemorating that are not necessarily in the in buildings, in built environments. Maybe they are not putting up, because also if you go to some local spaces, especially let's say in even within South Africa, if you go to some homelands in South Africa, people have ways of commemorating that do not really call for an architect, or it could just be stones, putting 2-3 stones together, and that's their own form of commemoration. But I think that the big idea of building monuments and memorials, I don't know if it's an African thing or if it could be said to not to be an African thing, but there are so many ways of thinking about people not wanting to build memorials and monuments. First, a post-war the post-war neoliberal economy, and so just that people have other ways of commemorating that do not necessarily mean building monuments and memorials.
Thank you so much, Adebayo and Richard, to the inputs that you have put into the question of nation building and memorial, and also into commemorations and memorialization, and how the state-sponsored commemorations are seen as a privileged, while the ones that are not sponsored as underprivileged. So I will start with the memorialization and memorial construction by saying that the concept of a memorial and building of memorials is actually something coming from outside Africa. That's why you find that in cases that there is an absence of a monument, a memorial monument, there are still some other forms that are used as memorialization. And this is like memorialization of an empty space, memorialization of the landscape. So the landscape as is stand as a memorial. So with or without a monument. Now you find also that sometimes other forms like oral tradition have been used as forms of memorial and memorialization. So you find that communities creating songs, riddles, plays that commemorate a particular either battle or event that took place in the community. Sometimes it's actually in forms of naming people, things, like as a form of a memorial. So you find that even in the most important events that occurred in Africa, you find that they miss monumental memorials that commemorate this kind of events. And for example, myself, I will use the Maji Maji War, which is where my scholarship was based, is that most of the memorials were created by missionaries. So very few memorials were actually constructed by the government to commemorate people who died during the war, although the war is actually seen as the foundation of the nation. So it seems like it's very connected to Tanzania as a country and the struggle for independence. But memorials that are actually constructed to commemorate that event are very few. At the community level, though, memorialization of empty spaces and also interpretation of monuments. So monuments that were constructed during the German colonialism are actually reinterpreted. Some of the monuments, for example, the prison is actually regarded as a grave, because most of the people who were taken from their community, incarcerated in the prison, they never returned to their people. So actually meaning has also been attached to some of the monuments, but the meanings that are attached to them are completely different from the function of the actual monument. And in terms of memorialization, it's actually a very dynamic thing. Sometimes you find that commemoration events are seen as the major part of like memorialization. So where there is a commemoration ceremony, it seems that this aspect is actually memorialized than other things that are not attached to a commemoration ceremony. So now in terms of the Maji Maji War, this is actually very complex because it is the same event, but commemorated differently by different groups. Now, when the community that is actually sponsored to conduct the commemoration has actually a different commemoration ceremony whereby the community actually contributes to food, drinks, and all actually sponsor, they self-sponsor all the activities that they do during the community commemoration ceremony. They even actually, because they are the Ngoni, they even invite the Ngonis from neighboring countries such as Mozambique, Malawi, to actually come and join them in this commemoration. But in other ethnic groups where the government is not sponsoring, but at the same time, there is also no self-mobilization to conduct this commemoration ceremony. So I don't have an absolute answer to you, Richard, about the economics of memory, and maybe it is something that I'll still need to think about even more, maybe.
Thank you very much. Chidioka Ona, you've raised your hand.
Okay, thank you so much for the very interesting lecture. So thank you, Sakiru, for the comment on building monuments and all of that. I often think that for us African scholars within memory studies, we have to start thinking more critically about what we think about memory or memorial monuments within African studies, because I deeply believe that the idea of monuments and museums, they are post-colonial, or they are not like the very indigenous to how we think of remembrance. But Nancy has already touched on that. It's just something that I want to bring to the forefront, that we have to think about indigenous ways without necessarily borrowing or focusing so much on how it has been theorized within the Western concepts. I know that it's very difficult because it means like going back to think about what memory means for us, but I think that is where we have to start if we really want to talk about memory studies within Africa. My question is, going back to some of the things that Sakiru said and Richard as well, the idea of transnational memory and the idea of like Pan-African memory and all of that. My interest now is mainly in what I'm thinking of as minor memories, or like memories within dominant memories. For example, the idea of whenever we just say Nigerian Biafran War, for example, we are actually including many other memories within it. Within the Biafran angle alone, we are including memory of say the Delta area, the Sekiri, and all the minority groups within Biafra alone. Not to even say the memory of like the gender aspects of the memory. Guess at War, Chinua Achebe is a good example of that. So within Rwanda, we often mention about just Tutsi and Hutu without remembering like the Tuai group, if that's how it's pronounced. So how do we even start thinking about these memories within memories, these marginalized memories within dominant memories, or even within the almighty Holocaust? How do you think about like the memory of say gay and lesbians within, how we remember the Holocaust memory? So I want to ask how we think about this. Otherwise, the idea of transnational memory or multinational memory for me moves from Rwanda to the Holocaust without really looking at the intricacies of memories or complexity of narratives even within these internal homogeneous memories that we look at.
I think, thank you, John. I'm just going to make a very quick comment. It's just marginalized memories have always been, were the thing that pushed me to do my postdoctoral research, because I realized that Rwandan memory discourse was dominated by either the victims or the survivors. Actually, the survivors, really. We haven't learned properly to perpetuate the memories of those who are no longer there. And so, so one of my concerns is how we actually, how do we, how do the departed speak in their own voice without having, so that's another topic. I also saw that, in research, we give voices to perpetrators, but I was quite staggered by the fact that as somebody who survived the genocide because somebody hid me for 3 months, I have always been amazed by the absence of memories of rescuers or as actually the people who held the humanity of when everything else was falling apart. And so because their stories are not do not fit in this dualistic or dichotomic approach to memory discourse in Rwanda, and because actually they do not always fit within the post-conflict vision of whoever is in power, they tend to disappear. But I think for me, they were the voices that reminded us so much of what we had lost and the potential that we had and what could have been saved had we had as many people as those rescuers at work. And I remember reading Hannah Arendt and the way I can't remember exactly what she said, and so how those minor voices, how those precious few, even if it's one, I think she was talking about a soldier called, I don't know, Schmidt, how those are the voices that are needed to be heard. So marginalized memories go with always with the politics of memories. They go with what we've talked about with the power behind the power that rends the voice to the memory. I always problematize the concept that the RPF in Rwanda, for instance, stopped the war stop the genocide, sorry, because where I lived on the border with the Congo, by the time the RPF arrived in August, the war had completely finished. But I think what the RPF did was to make sure that the memory of the genocide will live on, will never disappear. So I wonder how your question is pushing me to keep thinking about how do we render power and how do we find solidarities with marginalized and communities, and maybe how do we go beyond just memories of trauma or dysphoric memories, because I think somebody has started doing sort of film documentaries, just talking about the Rwandan Batwa and their music and their dancing and their loss of land and their loss of hunting ground. But those are, in a way, they do not feel as, because they're not memories of trauma, they do not tend to get the same traction or traction as other memories. I will stop talking. But what I was trying to think is we keep thinking about the issue between power and memories.
I'm going to have to go in a few minutes as I have another appointment. But there's just something I'd like to say about the very interesting discussion that's been developed, if I may. Is that okay? Yeah. I think perhaps not in memory studies, but certainly in other academic interdisciplines and post-disciplines, there are now well-established ways of doing what the last questioner was raising, about how we find the memory within the memory, which I think is a very interesting way of thinking about it. And I think that those ways of doing that can be summarized using the idea of reading the conventional way is to read along the grain, read along the archival grain. But the other way of doing it is to read across the grain. So we read the same materials, whether these are material entities like commemorative sites, or whether they're accounts of memories. We read them in the spirit in which it were intended to be read, but then we read it contrariwise. So I would say there are tools for doing that within memory studies, within gay and lesbian studies, within literary scholarship, and also within history as well. So I think there's a need for memory studies seeks to be post-disciplinary or interdisciplinary in a major way, but I think it still has a ways to go.
Thank you for this comment.
And I'm afraid in 3 minutes I would need to go because I'm in another meeting.
So let us thank you, Liz, for being here and for being part of this amazing event tonight. But before you leave, there's a question. Jen Yu Lin, would you like to ask your question?
Thanks to all the speakers for this amazing talk. Hi, Audubile, so good to see you. My question is specifically about the Pan-Africanism and perhaps the feasibility of applying colonial framework to commemorating African like histories. So I would like to add one more layer, which is about W.E.B. Du Bois and African American exceptionalism, which I would put it like that. Do you think, so my question is, do you think there is a tension between African American studies and African studies when it comes to memory? And where do you think we scholars are standing at right now? And how can we kind of like face or be in conversation with each other, like going beyond the continent of Africa and perhaps thinking about the actual practice of minor transnationalism? Thanks.
W.E. Du Bois was part of pan-nationalist activities. He was visited many times by Black intelligentsia and activists from South Africa and from elsewhere in Southern Africa. And they were all participants in the pan-national congresses that met in various places, starting in about, I can't remember the exact year, but I think 1906. So there is a very interesting example of seeking to do that, to work across boundaries in those important figures from the early part of the 20th century. And also the person I mentioned earlier, Olive Schreiner, was a friend of W.E.B. Du Bois and was very influenced by him. So I think there were transnational networks which facilitated thinking about the continent and its specific history as a continent and what was happening to it, given the so-called scramble for Africa of the imperialist powers. So I think there are some very interesting things that would come out of that, not least because they were striving to recover the memory of a before, an honourable, independent, free before, and what lessons they could learn from trying to establish what that before consisted of. So there's some very interesting reports of the Pan-African Congresses, which raise many of these issues. I think the first one was 1906, somewhere around then.
I know the last one was definitely in Manchester, 1975.
Yes, I know. Yeah, I'm a long-term resident of Manchester, so.
Oh.
And even Du Bois, visited Ghana at some point with, Kwame Nkrumah and all of them. So yeah, are you saying something, Liz?
Yeah, I was going to say that another way of thinking about it. I mean, you mentioned Dick Verbner and his wonderful. Dick Verbner was a colleague of mine at Manchester for many years. His subsequent book is called Tears of the Dead. And those of you who haven't read it, I think it provides a very rich, very powerful and very, very moving account of how you can recover the memory within the memory. And it concerns massacres and how memory and how the subterranean memory of what happened can be recovered. So it's a very, very powerful book and very different from the book that Adebayo mentioned. I'm terribly sorry. My other conference participants will be wondering where I am. So my apologies and thank you very much for inviting me. I've really enjoyed it. It's been a great event.
Thank you so much, Liz, for being here. We
Thank
really
you.
enjoyed it. Thank you. Richard, would you like to reply to Jan Hughes?
No. I mean, Jan, I was thinking about other pan-national Afro-American initiatives. I was thinking about the defunct idea of Rastafarianism and Ethiopianism, on the way people like Marcus Garvey actually imagined sort of an African descent, from Africa, the Caribbeans, the West Indies, and Africa. And what I find quite fascinating, and I'm trying to put this within the recent concept of Black Lives Matter and all that kind of stuff, is actually that there was this sort of, whether it was because of the era these ideas developed in, and the way people are crossing vast spaces with ideas, and whether, I don't know, my whole idea is that how do we get rich in our imagination, in imagining all those, in imagining all those possibilities. And actually now that, and that's something that we didn't have a chance to talk about, how actually now technology and social media platforms make this kind of transnational memories more possible and more vibrant. I know I'm not giving a full answer, but I'm trying to see that the picture we can build from what people like Du Bois suggested, what Marcus Garvey did, in a very complicated circumstances, and realizing that we have actually now at our fingertips ways that can make transnational memory possible. And it is how we involve, because technology is probably seen as a new thing. We don't connect it with memory, but it is absolutely vital in terms of transnational memories, of subaltern memories and marginalized memories, and how, how can we put technology and social media at the service of transnational and pan-national memorization. And the reason I'm saying this is very key. I'm studying something on Facebook. I'm studying a community called a true Sopekia is ... And that is, I think, within Rwandan diaspora, there is this sense that we have been going through too much through memories of trauma, and 1994 has become like a ceiling for us to think. We forgot that we used to go to the movies before 1994. We forgot that we used to date and we used to give gifts. So there's a community that has developed on Facebook, and people post mementos, memories of what it was like, to live before and outside trauma. So just being involved in this work has showed me how much potential we have in social media to resurrect these ways of memorizing. Sorry, I stopped talking.
Don't worry, thank you. I wish we could continue for hours on end. Thank you all for being here. And first of all, of course, to our speakers. Nancy has unfortunately already left. But this was an amazing event. You've provided so much food for thought. So thank you again very much, also for the questions. And yeah, let's stay in contact and continue the dialogue in some other form and forum.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye-bye,
Thank you for
everyone.
having us, Anna. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.